The summer heat in St. Augustine Parish never felt right that year. It clung too long, too heavy, too still, like the land itself was holding its breath. On the far edge of that cursed stretch of Louisiana soil stood the Bellford Plantation, a house of money and misery built on the backs of men who no longer believed in heaven. Inside, the master's daughter, Clara, spent her days peering through lace curtains, her pale face glistening with sweat, her eyes filled with a kind of hunger that no food could quiet. She was a large girl, the kind people whispered about not out of cruelty, but pity. And in those whispers, her father heard his own shame. Thomas Bellford was not a man of mercy. He had lost 3 wives to illness, 2 sons to the river, and his faith somewhere in between. When Clara began sneaking out to talk with the slaves, laughing with them, sitting too close to the dark-skinned man who sang at night, something inside Thomas snapped. He decided she needed to learn her place, and so he made a decision no father should ever make. They say he led her into the woods at dusk, with Elijah walking behind, silent as always. The cicadas screamed in the trees, the sky turning the color of blood as they reached the old cabin by the swamp. Thomas left her there, his daughter, his blood in the care of the man he thought beneath him. And as he walked away, he heard her voice tremble behind him. "Papa, please don't leave me here." But he didn't turn back. He couldn't. Because somewhere behind him, from deep within those trees, something else had already started whispering her name. In the late 1800s, the humid air of rural Louisiana seemed to hang thick with secrets. The Bellford Plantation stood isolated among miles of sugarcane fields and swampland, its white pillars stained by decades of decay and sorrow. Thomas Bellford, the master of the estate, was a man both feared and pitied by the locals. Once known for his charm and wealth, he had grown bitter and unpredictable over the years. His wife had died of fever, his sons drowned in a boating accident, and only his daughter Clara remained, a girl whose presence was a reminder of everything he had lost. Clara was unlike other women in the parish. She was large, slow-moving, and painfully shy. Her father saw her as a disappointment, a blemish on the family name. Her weight made her the target of gossip among neighboring families, and Thomas, unable to bear the shame, began to see her not as his child but as a curse he was forced to live with. The plantation slaves had long learned to stay silent around their master, but even they noticed his growing resentment. When Clara began showing kindness to them, sneaking out at night to talk or share bread, Thomas's anger turned into disgust. He believed she was mocking him, crossing the line between master and servant, between white and black. The day he caught her laughing with Elijah, a quiet slave known for his unsettling calm, something inside him hardened beyond repair. Elijah was different from the others. He carried himself with a strange dignity and spoke little, yet there was something in his eyes that unnerved Thomas. Perhaps it was intelligence. Perhaps defiance. Or perhaps it was the way he looked at Clara, not with lust, but with pity. When word spread through the fields that Clara had once again defied her father, Thomas decided to make an example of her. That night, he summoned Elijah to the main house. Servants claimed they heard the sound of glass breaking, a woman's sobs, and the heavy tread of boots across the porch. No one dared to intervene. By dawn, Thomas emerged, pale and shaking, his shirt soaked in sweat. He ordered Elijah to follow him and commanded Clara to come along. Together, they walked past the cane fields and into the woods, toward a small abandoned cabin by the swamp, a place where even the bravest workers refused to go after sunset. Those who watched from afar would later swear that the look on Clara's face was not fear, but confusion, as if she couldn't understand what crime she had committed to deserve what was coming. It was there, in that forgotten corner of the plantation, that Thomas Bellford decided to give his daughter away. Elijah was unlike any man on the Bellford Plantation. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that reflected a depth few dared to meet. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet when he did, his voice carried a calmness that seemed to quiet even the restless winds that moved through the cane fields. The other slaves respected him, but they also feared him. They whispered that Elijah was touched by something old, something that lived beyond the reach of the white man's God. Some said he could speak to the woods, that at night, when the moon was low, he would wander near the swamp and murmur to the trees as if they answered back. The overseer once followed him into the forest and returned pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. From that night on, no one followed Elijah again. Thomas Bellford despised the man's silence. He took it as defiance, as a challenge to his authority. Yet he couldn't bring himself to punish him the way he did the others. Elijah's quiet strength unsettled him in a way that words couldn't explain. There was a presence about the man, something unbroken, something that refused to be tamed. When Thomas watched him work, it felt as though Elijah was not laboring for him but for something else, something unseen. That quiet defiance only deepened Thomas's hatred, and when he caught his daughter Clara speaking to him near the well one afternoon, laughing softly like a child, the fury that had long been festering inside him found its focus. The rumor spread quickly that the master's daughter had been seen too close to one of the slaves. It was a sin that could not be forgiven in that time and place. To Thomas, it wasn't just shame. It was betrayal. In his twisted mind, he convinced himself that Elijah had bewitched his daughter, that his strange connection to the woods had poisoned her thoughts. And so, in a cruel act of retribution disguised as punishment, he decided to give her to Elijah not as a wife, not as a companion, but as property. The decision was so monstrous that even the overseer hesitated to carry it out, but Thomas's command was absolute. When he told Elijah what he would do, the man did not protest. He simply nodded once, his face unreadable. Later that night, as the sun sank behind the cypress trees, Elijah stood outside the cabin where Clara waited, the swamp humming with insects and shadows. Those who saw him pass swore the air grew colder when he did, and from that moment on, no one ever looked him directly in the eyes again. The cabin stood deep within the swamp, half swallowed by vines and years of decay. It was a place no one willingly visited after dark, a leftover remnant from the early days of the plantation when slaves had been housed far from the main estate. The air there always smelled of damp wood and rot, and the cicadas sang so loud it drowned out every other sound except, as some would later claim, for the faint echo of a woman's crying. When Thomas Bellford left his daughter Clara there with Elijah, he walked away without looking back. He didn't want to see her tears or the fear in her face. The memory of it might have undone his resolve, and he couldn't afford that weakness. The act itself was meant to humiliate her, to teach her obedience, to erase what he saw as disgrace. But what he unleashed that night would mark the beginning of something the plantation could never forget. Clara begged him not to leave, but her father's back remained turned until his figure disappeared into the mist. Elijah said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway of the cabin, eyes fixed on the dying light filtering through the cypress branches. To her surprise, he did not approach or touch her. He only told her in a quiet voice to go inside, to stay near the fire, and to lock the door once he stepped out. His words carried a strange calm that both frightened and soothed her. The night came quickly, thick and heavy, and as the darkness pressed against the wooden walls, Clara heard sounds she could not explain, whispers from outside, the snapping of branches, and something moving through the water with slow, deliberate steps. Days passed in that cabin, though no one knew what truly happened between them. Workers said they could hear her screams echoing through the swamp, piercing and desperate, like an animal caught in a trap. Others claimed they weren't screams at all but laughter that rose and broke in the humid air. Elijah was seen only rarely, emerging at dawn to fetch water or food, his face shadowed and unreadable. The plantation hands who caught glimpses of him whispered that he was changing, that his eyes had taken on a strange light, and his voice, when he spoke, sounded like it came from somewhere far away. Then, one morning, the screams stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It hung over the plantation like a curse, and though Thomas pretended not to notice, the sound of that silence followed him everywhere he went. By the end of the second week, the Bellford Plantation had grown restless. The field hands whispered that something was wrong at the old cabin by the swamp, that no one had seen Clara for days and that Elijah had stopped coming out altogether. The food that was left on the wooden stoop each morning remained untouched, and the thick, humming quiet of the forest seemed to have swallowed the place whole. When the overseer finally sent 2 men to check on them, they returned pale and trembling, refusing to go back. They claimed the air around the cabin felt wrong, heavy, still, and colder than the rest of the swamp. The smell hit them before they even reached the door, a stench like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. One of them swore he heard movement inside, slow and wet, though no voice answered their calls. When Thomas Bellford heard the reports, His face went white, though he hid it beneath anger. He ordered the overseer to gather more men and bring an axe. Together they walked down the narrow path through the cypress trees, the sound of their boots muffled by the mud. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to sink, and the sky burned orange behind the moss-draped branches. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had seen before. The door was sealed shut from the inside, not locked, but nailed, the iron spikes driven so deep that the wood had splintered. Every window was covered with a dark, sticky film that looked at first like tar, but when the overseer touched it, his fingers came away wet and red. They called Clara's name, but there was no answer. The stillness that followed felt alive, pulsing faintly, as if the cabin itself was breathing. One man swore he heard a sound coming from within, a faint dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor. When they finally pried the door loose, a gust of air escaped, thick and foul, strong enough to make one of the men vomit. The inside was completely dark except for the dying glow of embers in the hearth. The floor was slick beneath their boots, and the smell of decay clung to their clothes. There was no sign of Clara or Elijah, no body, no movement. Only the sense that something had happened there, something that the walls themselves were trying to hide. In the corner, faint marks were carved into the wood, strange symbols no one recognized, arranged in a circle around a blackened stain that pulsed faintly, as if it had once been alive. A month after the cabin was found sealed and empty, the Bellford Plantation began to change. The air grew thicker, the nights longer, and a strange unease crept over everyone who lived there. The workers spoke in hushed tones, saying the swamp had turned restless, that the water no longer reflected the sky but something darker, as if the earth itself was sick. Thomas Bellford tried to dismiss their fears, insisting that his daughter had run away, that Elijah had taken her and fled into the marsh. Yet deep inside, he knew better. The silence of the woods pressed against him, and sleep came harder each night. When it did, it brought dreams, heavy, fevered visions of Clara standing at the edge of the trees, her face pale and glistening, her mouth moving soundlessly in the dark. At first, the whispers were faint, almost like the sigh of the wind through the cane fields. They came at dusk, when the sky turned the color of rust and the swamp began to hum with life. Thomas would stand on his porch with a drink in hand and hear it, a low, wavering voice calling from the woods. He told himself it was imagination, the mind's cruel trick, but the voice grew clearer with each passing night. Soon, he could make out the words. It wasn't a stranger's voice at all. It was Clara's. She called for him softly, pleading in the same trembling tone she had used the night he left her at the cabin. "Papa," she whispered, "please bring me home." The first time he heard it, he froze. The second time, he answered. He stepped off the porch and followed the sound down the narrow path leading toward the swamp. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, and the ground beneath his boots grew soft, sinking slightly with each step. The whispering seemed to move around him, circling, sometimes in front of him, sometimes behind. He called her name, his voice breaking, but only the trees replied, their branches creaking like bones in the wind. Then, just as he reached the clearing where the cabin once stood, the sound stopped. The air went completely still. The woods seemed to be listening. And then, faintly, from somewhere in the dark water beyond the trees, he heard it again, closer this time, almost at his ear. "You left me here, Papa," the voice murmured. "Now I can't leave." He stumbled backward in panic, running through the brush until the plantation lights reappeared in the distance, his heart hammering as he realized the voice had followed him all the way home. By the time autumn settled over the Bellford Plantation, the whispers had driven nearly everyone to the edge of madness. The workers refused to go near the swamp, claiming the air their whispered names and that something watched them from behind the trees. The overseer, a hard man who feared nothing living, grew tired of the stories and declared he would see the cabin for himself. He took a lantern, a rifle, and 2 men to accompany him, though one turned back before they reached the clearing, shaken by the smell that drifted through the trees. The remaining pair pressed on, the swamp thick around them, the water glinting like glass beneath the moonlight. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than before, almost sunken into the earth, as though the swamp was trying to reclaim it. The walls were streaked with black mold, and the faint sound of dripping echoed from somewhere inside. The overseer kicked the door, but it wouldn't budge. Someone, or something, had nailed it shut again from within. He swung the lantern higher, his eyes catching faint carvings along the wooden planks, strange markings that hadn't been there weeks before. When he forced the door open with the butt of his rifle, a gust of cold air spilled out, carrying a stench so foul it burned the back of his throat. The flame of his lantern flickered, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls. There was no sign of life, but the air felt wrong, heavy and thick, almost vibrating. His boots stuck slightly to the floor as he stepped forward, the wood slick with something that glistened in the light. Then his eyes fell upon the floorboards near the hearth, and he froze. There, etched deep into the planks, was the outline of a human body, Clara's shape, unmistakable in its size and curvature, burned into the wood like a brand. It was as if lightning had struck her where she stood, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of her form. The overseer stumbled back, muttering prayers under his breath, while the other man whispered that they should leave. But before they could turn, the lantern flickered again, and the faint sound of breathing filled the room. It wasn't coming from either of them. The air seemed to hum, and the burned shape on the floor appeared to shimmer, as if it were still hot. The overseer dropped the lantern in terror, and the flame caught for a moment before sputtering out. When they fled the cabin, the swamp seemed to echo with a low, heavy sound, not quite a cry, not quite laughter, something in between, something human but not alive. The day after the overseer's visit to the cabin, the plantation was gripped by a silence that felt unnatural. Even the cicadas had gone still, and the swamp seemed to be holding its breath. The story of what the overseer had seen spread quickly among the workers, though each retelling made it worse. Some said Clara's spirit had been burned into the floor by the devil himself. Others whispered that Elijah had performed a ritual to bind her to the earth. By morning, the whispers had reached Thomas Bellford. Rage replaced fear in his heart, and he ordered Elijah found at once. The search took all day. The fields were turned upside down, the workers forced into the woods with torches, the air thick with dread. When they finally found him, he was kneeling at the edge of the swamp, his hands buried in the wet soil, his lips moving silently as if in prayer. When they dragged him out, he didn't resist. His eyes were distant, fixed somewhere beyond the trees, and he spoke only once, so softly that most didn't hear. "She's with them now," he said, his voice flat and empty, as though he no longer belonged to this world. They brought him before Thomas at the big house, where the master demanded to know what had happened to his daughter. Elijah only looked up slowly, his face unreadable, and whispered, "You gave her to the swamp, not me." The words sent a shiver through everyone present. Thomas, consumed by fury and shame, struck him across the face and ordered him to be hanged at sunrise. That night, as the wind howled through the cane fields, the workers gathered by the gallows with grim faces. Elijah stood calm, his wrists bound, his gaze turned toward the dark line of the trees. There was no fear in him, no struggle. As the rope was placed around his neck, he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "She isn't gone," he said. "She's waiting." The overseer pulled the lever, and the body dropped. For a long time, no one moved. The sound of the rope creaking was the only thing that broke the silence. By morning, when they returned to cut him down, the noose hung empty. The rope swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sign of Elijah's body. The ground beneath the gallows was soaked with water, though it hadn't rained in days, and faint footprints, wide, bare, and sunken deep, led away toward the swamp. The morning after Elijah's body vanished, the plantation awoke to find the ground scarred with strange footprints that hadn't been there before. They appeared in the soft mud near the fields, then stretched toward the swamp, each one deep and heavy, as though pressed by something enormous. The tracks were uneven, some too large to be human, others wide and flat, leaving behind impressions that filled slowly with water. No one dared follow them, not even the overseer, who now refused to go anywhere near the woods after sunset. The workers whispered that Elijah had returned, that death had not claimed him but changed him. Others swore that Clara was walking again, though not as she once was. Every night, the sounds from the swamp grew louder, footsteps, splashing, and low groans that carried across the cane fields like the echo of a giant moving through the dark. Thomas Bellford tried to dismiss the stories at first. He ordered the prints covered and the talk silenced, but the evidence kept returning. Each morning new tracks appeared, closer to the house, as if whatever left them was circling, testing the edges of the land. The dogs barked endlessly at night, but when the men went to see what roused them, the animals would fall silent, trembling and whimpering. One evening, Thomas stepped outside with a lantern and followed the path of the prince himself. They led through the grass, past the stables, and down toward the trees. The light flickered in his shaking hand as he crouched to study one closely. It was larger than any human foot, yet the shape was disturbingly familiar, toes splayed, heel rounded, the arch sunken deep. It was Clara's size, and yet not hers. The mud around the print shimmered faintly, as if breathing. That night, the workers claimed they saw a figure moving along the tree line, massive, slow, and hunched. From a distance, it looked human, but its arms hung too long, and its steps made the ground tremble. One man swore it turned its head toward them, and the lantern light caught the pale curve of a face, swollen and slick, the eyes dull like glass. When Thomas heard this, his denial broke into panic. He began to drink heavily, muttering that it was Elijah's doing, that he had cursed the land. But in the dark corners of his mind, another thought grew louder, that perhaps it wasn't Elijah haunting him at all. Perhaps it was his daughter, returned from the woods not to seek comfort, but to remind him of what he had done, wearing a body no longer her own. As weeks passed, the Bellford Plantation seemed to rot from within. The air felt heavier, and the swamp's edge crept closer to the fields, swallowing bits of land as if the earth itself no longer wanted to hold that place. The livestock began to die without reason. Each morning, the workers would find another animal lying in the dirt, bloated and stiff, eyes wide and staring as though they had seen something unspeakable. The horses refused to go near the water, the cattle grew restless, and even the birds avoided the area, flying in wide arcs around the property. Thomas Bellford tried to control it, burning the carcasses and demanding silence, but the fear spread faster than fire. Every night the sounds grew stranger, groans, scraping, and a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo beneath the ground. Then came the sightings. One by one, the workers began to claim they had seen Clara near the woods at dusk. Some said she stood half submerged in the swamp, her dress soaked and clinging to her pale skin. Others swore they saw her wandering near the cane fields, her figure heavy but moving with a slow, unnatural grace. They described her face as almost familiar but somehow wrong, thinner, drawn tight, with eyes that no longer blinked. Her lips were parted, but when she opened her mouth, no words came out, only a faint gurgling sound like water running through a pipe. The men who saw her refused to return to work, and those forced to stay began to leave offerings at the edge of the swamp, bits of food, flowers, even small coins, anything to keep her from coming closer. Thomas's wife, Eleanor, was the last to see her. It was late one night when she awoke to the sound of something brushing against the window. Thinking it was a branch, she went to close it, but when she looked outside, she froze. Clara was standing at the edge of the trees, illuminated by the moonlight, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Her eyes caught the light, and for a brief moment, Eleanor swore they gleamed like glass marbles, empty yet staring straight into her. Clara raised a hand, or what looked like a hand, and the motion was slow, deliberate, almost pleading. Eleanor screamed, and when Thomas rushed to her side, there was nothing outside but the whisper of the wind and the faint impression of wet footprints leading back toward the woods. From that night on, Eleanor refused to sleep near a window, and Thomas began locking every door before sunset, knowing it would not matter if she decided to return again. The end came quietly, the way a fever finally breaks after days of delirium. For weeks the plantation had been unraveling, its people leaving in the dark of night, their footsteps fading down the road without goodbye. Thomas Bellford stayed behind, too proud or too broken to abandon the land that had been in his family for generations. He stopped attending to the fields, stopped writing in his ledger, stopped sleeping altogether. He wandered the house with a lantern in hand, listening for the faint sounds that now came from the walls, soft knocks, wet dragging, whispers that sometimes spoke his name. Every mirror in the house had been covered. Every door was bolted. But the smell of swamp water had begun to seep through the cracks, sweet and foul at once, carrying with it the faint echo of his daughter's voice. The house was dying just as surely as he was. It began with a single spark. No one knew how the fire started, whether it was a lantern overturned, or the lightning that split the cypress tree in the yard. The flames caught quickly, feeding on the dry timbers of the old house. By the time the workers who remained noticed, the plantation was already engulfed. The fire moved like something alive, twisting through the halls, roaring as if it had waited years for release. Some swore they saw figures in the flames, shapes that looked like a woman and a man, holding each other as they burned. Thomas was last seen at the top window, his face pale in the glow, shouting something no one could hear before the roof collapsed and the house fell in on itself. When the fire finally died, the land was nothing but ash and silence. The swamp had crept in overnight, swallowing the foundation and filling the crater with dark, still water. The Bellford Plantation vanished from maps not long after. The locals avoided the area, calling it cursed ground. Years later, hunters who dared to venture too close told stories of strange prints appearing in the mud, broad, heavy, and human-like, yet far too large to belong to any living person. Some said they saw a shape moving through the mist, a massive figure wading slowly through the black water. Those who followed the tracks found they led only one way, deeper and deeper into the woods where the old cabin once stood. And though no one ever saw her face clearly again, the air there still carried her voice on certain nights, whispering softly from beneath the trees, calling for her father to bring her home.